So we're about to start the next panel, which is on the welfare queen and the social construction of motherhood and family. So let me start by congratulating Camille Rich for putting together this wonderful event and getting all these people from all over the country to talk about this important subject. My name is Rosal Pereñas, and I'm the outgoing chair of the sociology department. I say outgoing, you know, outgoing chair of the sociology department here at USC. My work also, some of my work also looks at mothering. I particularly look at this phenomenon of transnational mothers. So when migrant women leave their kids behind in the country of origin. So I'm happy to be moderating this panel. We're not going to follow the order given. Eleanor Brown requested to speak first, and so she will, and then we're just going to follow the order after that. But let me, before I pass the floor to Eleanor, let me just introduce the speakers.
We said we're going to go in order.
Oh, okay.
We're going to go in order.
Okay, so I'm going to follow that order. Okay, so our first speaker is Eleanor Brown, who is an associate professor of law at George Washington University Law School. Before she joined the faculty at GW, she was a Lewis Fellow at the at Harvard Law School. She was also a Rhodes Scholar, and she attended Oxford University, where she received a master's degree in politics. The work of Professor Brown lies at the intersection of globalization, development, migration, and the law, and her talk is titled Developing Motherhood, Stigmatized Single Motherhood, and the Anxieties of the Black Middle Class. And then our next speaker is Andrea Freeman, who is a assistant professor of law at the University of Hawaii. She teaches constitutional law, federal courts, and race and law, and she writes in the areas of critical race and class theory, health economics, and food policy, with a focus on her theory of food oppression. The title of her talk is First, Food Injustice, Racial Disparities, and Breastfeeding as Food Oppression. And the next speaker after that is Robin Lenhart. And Professor Lenhart is an associate professor of law at Fordham University School of Law, and she is, so her work focuses on issues pertaining to race, civil rights, family law, and constitutional law. The title of her talk is Structuring Families, Structuring Race. And last but not least, our final speaker is Professor Catherine Sabbath, who teaches at University North Carolina School of Law, where she's also an assistant professor of law. Her work looks, her area of expertise are access to justice, civil litigation, civil procedure, civil rights, employment, discrimination, federal courts issues, and public interest lawyering. So please join me in welcoming our wonderful group of panelists. And so they'll have 12 minutes each to speak. I'm starting with Eleanor at the end of the.
Thank you very much for having me. Forgive me for having the American Airlines blanket that I got on the flight from Jamaica. Since I'm Jamaican, I have the excuse that I am cold and I do not want to be distracted by the perverse California temperatures. So I have decided to use my American Airlines blanket. So forgive me. Now, I am, I would say, an accidental panelist. Now, how do I come to be here? I come to be here because maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I got a call from Michelle Goodwin. Michelle was at that point in a visiting chair at Maryland. And she was doing a panel on family secrets and the law. And why in heaven's name Michelle thought I was good for this panel, I do not know. But the thought process she set me on, a few of us here were actually on that panel, Camille was there too, made me realize that I have another book that I didn't realize that I have. Now, the reason that I am talking first is because for the first time I'm going to try and speak totally extemporaneously without PowerPoint and without notes. I need to learn how to do this. So I figure I'm among friends, so this is the time to do it. So, so what I decided to talk about at Michelle's panel, although I didn't see the connections at the time, was my friend Rick Banks had recently written a book called Is Marriage for White People, which is a controversial book. A lot of our colleagues did not react as positively as one might put it diplomatically. I had a different reaction to the book. Before Rick wrote the book, in fact, I remember we were at I can't remember if it was a WLS or a Law and Society conference, and Rick mentioned that someone like me might be an interesting person to talk to. I didn't talk to him, something that I will eternally regret. Now, why would Rick have been interested in talking to me? I am a single mother of 3 children. And Rick had interviewed a lot of black professional women who had not married, had not had children. And so the fact that I had not married and never, ever, ever been married, and never will be, and did not have 1 child but had 2 and had 3 children was striking to him. Now, me being West Indian, I just thought it was absolutely unusual that anybody would want to talk to me, because where I come from, people have 4, 5, 6 with no husband. So, in fact, our most famous book of anthropology is called My Mother Who Fathered Me. That's the name of the book. And so I am completely atypical. Well, no, I'm completely atypical here, but completely typical in the West Indies. That's the point I'm making. No, at the same time, Rick asked me if I would talk to him, and I declined, which I regret. When I was doing my fellowship at the Lewis Fellowship, I spent more time, I have to confess, in the sociology department than I did in the law school. That turned out to be a blessing in disguise. No disrespect to my fellow law professors, because there was a seminar, a sociology seminar. I remember both Bill Wilson, as in the great William Julius Wilson, controversial for some people here, I know, and Orlando Pattison were at that seminar. And afterwards there was a dinner, and a whole group of sociology students came to the dinner. And I remember there was a conversation at that dinner. It was very tense. A student said something. In Jamaica we would say you could cut cheese. The tension was so strong you could cut cheese. But a student said at the dinner that very few of the people who were at Harvard were in fact African American. Most of the people who were at Harvard were West Indian, pretending to be African American. They said this at the dinner. And the students' words, although crudely put, I thought were a mirror into a conversation that needed to be had about, and this is the way I'm going to frame it, and you're going to bear with me while I break it down while speaking extemporaneously, about who is transmitting human capital in elite settings, and why are certain people doing it better, quote unquote, than others. And I'm going to, I promise, connect it back to childbearing, and I promise also connect it back to what in law Professor Rees we would call negative perception externalities associated by elite black women with having children out of wedlock. And I think my basic point, and it's going to take me a little time to get to that because I'm connecting different literatures, is that I think there's a difference in how West Indians versus African Americans perceive the negative perception externalities associated with having children even if you are not married. And I think that has consequences for elite human capital transmission, and I think that has consequences for the broader black community. That's the argument I'm trying to make. I need to pull together several literatures to make it, and I'm still in very initial thoughts, so I'm asking you to bear with me. Okay, so let me start here. Okay, in my real life, I do law and development. I do property, contract, and I also do how migrants build assets, okay? So the core of my work is property scholarship. I promise I'll connect it all back. The book that I'm working on now, and we'll see whether or not I have this other book, is about differences in asset acquisition patterns between West Indian Americans and African Americans. Now, far less well known than Moynihan's, notorious document that we have all discussed here, is that he did a study afterwards with Nathan Glazer of New York's ethnic groups, where he looked at patterns of upward mobility among Jewish New Yorkers, Italian New Yorkers, Irish, and he has a whole section on what he calls this distinctive group of black people. He distinguishes them from Southern blacks. He talks about their peculiar value sets, the disproportionate emphasis on saving, a strong work ethic, family. And this peculiar group of black people are West Indians. And he says that they're so unusual that when you look at their pattern of upward mobility, they look like white ethnics. Hint, hint, not African Americans. Okay, that's what Moynihan and Glazer say in their study. No, this actually has a long history in the social science literature. Oh my God, I have 5 minutes. But it has a long history. I can talk about it in the questions, but E. Franklin Frazier had reference to West Indians. And so, suffice it to say, the dominant notion in the sociological literature for some time has been that if this particular group of black people do so well, and if native black people, I'm using the language in the literature, so immigrant black people are overwhelmingly West Indians, because up until very recently, most black migrants were West Indians. Native black people are persons who are descended from slaves within the United States. So if immigrant black people are doing so well, and native black people are not, what is wrong with native black people? Okay? That is the, I'm being very crass in my language because of time constraints, but that is the subtext of the literature. Now, what I'm doing in my book, which is very different than anything in the literature to this point, is I'm looking at how property was allocated to slaves under plantation slavery in the West Indies versus in the antebellum South. And I am arguing that the British had a system which made West Indian slaves property holders during the institution of slavery, property holding property. And that has long-term consequences for how West Indians acquire assets. They leave slavery with assets. They migrate to the United States with assets. So when Colin Powell's parents and Eric Holder's grandparents and Susan Rice's grandparents come off the boat, they have assets. And my argument is that it is not fair to compare a group that had such that was so way ahead in property ownership. And it's not fair to compare that group structurally to a group that did not have those property advantages early on, okay? Now, this is why I think it is connected to what I said earlier. If you look at certain migration streams, and West Indians are very unusual in this respect, women predominate in certain migration streams. This is unusual because, particularly in early immigrant streams, if you are a woman, particularly an unmarried woman coming off a boat in Ellis Island, you are deemed to be a prostitute. Unmarried women were not to travel alone. A lot of West Indian women come in. They are independent earners. They're sending money back to the West Indies. They are also having children. They're continuing what they were doing in the West Indies before, i.e., even if a husband is not present, they go ahead and they have children. Now, I think if the question becomes, am I willing to assume the risk that if the man disappears, I can continue on my own? And if you look at that through that prism, I think there might be a differential in the willingness to assume that risk, okay? If you are, the phraseology I'm going to use is elite and quasi-elite, and I'll explain what I mean by the phrase quasi-elite. If you're coming out of that immigrant background versus if you're coming out of what the sociological literature would call a native African-American background. I know I have to finish, but just one more thing to say. Now, the reason that I say that is, I really should have reread this section of Rick's book last night. I didn't, so I hope that I'm remembering correctly. But Rick has this has this image of this African-American woman he's interviewing in a coffee shop. I think it's in the Pont Circle. And she is reflecting with great distress on the fact that she's not going to be able to give her Harvard legacy status to her children. Because there are no children. And now what that is capturing is, that's a transmission of elite human capital. That's what she's essentially saying. And now, when I read that comment, and then what I've been doing, I don't have any empirical data yet, but I have been interviewing some of these kids. Douglas Massey has a study where he actually looks at the representation, that he has a cohort of elite schools, he uses census data. This is the Princeton demographer, Douglas Massey, of American Apartheid and the Mexican Migration Project. He does work on West Indians as well. And he shows how overrepresented they are in these elite schools. A lot of those persons are not children of elites, they're children of what I call quasi-elites. So let me tell you what a paradigmatic quasi-elite would be. Somebody in New York City who is earning $50,000–$60,000 US a year, maybe as a nurse's aide, who is paying $10,000 US a year to send their child to a Episcopal, is that what Americans call Anglican? Episcopal, to an Episcopal school, church subsidized. That child then goes into something called ABC, which is a better chance, which then feeds them into Choate or Milton Academy, which then feeds them into Harvard. So what, and this is for somebody earning, single mother earning $50,000–$60,000 a year, who, you get what I'm saying? So my question is, what is the differential between that woman that would lead her to take on the risk in comparison to the typical subject of Rick's book? You get what I'm saying? And that might account for the differential human capital transmission. Last point, because I'm at zero, is if you think of it from the perspective of the World Bank, they do a lot of research on this. Unusual way to conceptualize the question, but if Black America were to be a country, one of the big indices of development that the World Bank looks at is, are elite or quasi-elite women having children? That's one of their policy goals. That women who, one of the big indices of long-term development is whether women equipped with human capital are transmitting it. If Black America were a country, they would consider it a subject of some concern that the least married, least childbearing population is the one that is best equipped with human capital. So I just leave you with that thought, disparate thoughts being pulled together. Happy to answer more in the question.
Can I just ask, do you think the welfare queen is the reason these middle class Black women?
Absolutely. So the negative perception externalities argument is the law professor Ree's way of saying what we would say in Jamaica is, if you have the baby out of wedlock, you would be butu. I think the word you would use here is ghetto. You would be perceived as ghetto. Do you really want to be a partner as Arnold and Porter walking around with no wedding ring and a big belly? To be very crass, but that's what we would say at home. The answer to that question is no. My point is, if you are someone who is well equipped with human capital and you have made that decision because of the negative externalities, perception or externalities, with the welfare queen notion, you get what I'm saying? It has consequences for who gets you, how human capital is transmitted, and for the broader community. That's the point that I'm making. So.
Okay, so our next speaker is Andrea Freeman. Yeah. Okay, great.
All right. And I need
Okay, so we start timing.
where are the slides?
Where are the slides? I don't know.
Okay, they put them up?
Technical help.
I need my slide. And that is because it's very difficult. Not so students. They're all not
I have no slides.
Oh, you want to go, Catherine? Yeah.
If you want.
Yeah, then we'll find the slides. Yeah.
Alright,
So much for
I
our
need to
plan.
Get my brain.
Sorry to put you
No,
on
I
the
can do
spot.
it. I'm ready. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay.
It's one advantage of being low tech.
Yeah.
About
I'm
the
as
only
low
one.
tech as you. I see your phone.
Yeah, that people laugh at, but
Okay, so our next speaker is Catherine Sabbath.
so
Okay.
thank you, and thank you so much to Camille and everyone involved in making this happen today. I really, really feel honored to be in this group in general and on this panel as in particular. So my writing relates to the role of lawyers in society, to cause lawyers in particular, and the extent to which they can or can't make things better, and to access to justice. And so what I want to try to do today is link some of my work on access to justice to some, thank you very much. What I want to try to do today is link some of my work on access to justice to some interviews I conducted some time ago with a group of welfare rights activists. And so in my mind, these things do come together, and we'll see if they come together in your minds and if this makes sense to you all. This is my first time really thinking this stuff through, so I'm very open to ideas. So the main thing that I want to talk about is how our conceptions of mothering work shape our institutional approaches to access to justice. And what I want to suggest is that to the extent that there's a devaluation of caretaking work, that devaluation informs our conception of what rights we value, and relatedly, how we assign the right to have those rights articulated and defended by attorneys. And I want to make a small caveat, which is I think we all know that rights talk has certain complications to it. If there's time, I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between rights and needs and what we mean when we talk about those different things. But for now, my presentation is really going to focus on the recognition of rights as a recognition of value. So very briefly, access to counsel in civil and criminal cases, as people know, is quite different in this country from one another. As most Americans can cite the rule they see on TV about how criminal defendants who can't afford counsel will have it provided at the expense of the state. Many of us know that, in fact, the actual rule is a bit more nuanced than that, but there's a general idea that the Supreme Court has embraced, that there is something about counsel that is essential to a fair trial, that is essential to what it means to have the right to be heard at all. And that is considered to be true so long as there's a prison sentence at stake, even if that sentence is as short as 1 day, so long as it's a criminal case. We know civil litigants receive very different treatment. At least in federal constitutional jurisprudence, there's actually a presumption against appointment of counsel in many ways, and overcoming that presumption is required to be done on a case-by-case basis with balancing costs and benefits. Of course, states are free to provide more than the U.S. Constitution does, and many states and localities do, in fact, provide more. But the federal jurisprudence tells us that the provision of counsel in criminal matters is going to be governed by bright-line rules, bright-line mandates. In civil, if it's addressed at all, it's going to be a case-by-case basis with a lot of discretion. So why do we have this distinction? And there could be various historical legal realist explanations, but in terms of trying to find an actual principled reason, it seems to me a few possibilities might be that come up would be the text of the Constitution, the 6th versus 14th Amendment, of course, the liberty interests at stake in criminal cases. Of course, we know from Turner that liberty interests come up in other contexts too, but putting that aside for the moment. The third being the identity of the party on the other side. That is, if you have the state on the other side, in criminal, it's always the case that the party on the other side in criminal cases is the state. So each of those explanations might carry some weight, but as I've written elsewhere, each of those also has some pretty basic flaws. And so what I've been starting to think about, and what I want to focus my time on, is whether there's actually a gender dimension to this problem. And what I mean by that is that maybe there's something about using a gendered lens that affects how we talk about these problems and could potentially affect how we might solve some of these problems. So we know as a descriptive matter that men are overrepresented in the criminal justice system and are overrepresented as criminal defendants. Of course, we also know that there are more women entering the criminal justice system, but still the image is vastly male, vastly masculine, right? And at the same time, women are overrepresented in major categories of civil cases where there's absolutely no federal right to counsel, right? So welfare benefits, termination of parental rights, housing, there are more examples, of course. And so housing, for example, is one where there's been some interesting research by Matthew Desmond, the sociologist, talking about how essentially he says, quote, in poor black neighborhoods, eviction is to women what incarceration is to men. We know that a huge proportion of civil cases involving poor people are eviction cases, and as a descriptive matter, these are disproportionately women. But of course, there's no federal right to an attorney in housing cases, and there have been some developments at the local level, particularly in California and recently in New York City. But again, no one's claiming this is a federal constitutional right. No one's claiming that it even should be. So we know in the welfare benefits context, we know Goldberg versus Kelly recognized a due process right to notice and an opportunity to be heard prior to the termination of welfare benefits. But of course, the court did not rule that there's a right to appointed counsel. The court did say instead that a person would have the right to retain an attorney, which of course really just puts a person in the position that we have with everything else, which is if you can buy it, if you can buy justice or anything else, that's your business, but that's a private matter. Okay, that it does not, of course, assign responsibility to the state for providing lawyers as a way of protecting the interests at stake or for defining what rights should be allocated in any public way. It certainly doesn't value the articulation of the rights of welfare recipients as something worthy of protection by the state. Termination of parental rights is an interesting one as well. We know, oh my goodness, that that the vast majority of parents who end up losing their children to the state in formal proceedings are mothers. And the interest at stake here, again, is considered insufficiently important to require appointment of counsel. We know that 2 decades after Gideon, the court heard the Lassiter case. I will, in the interest of time, skip most of it. But again, the court sort of gave lip service to the idea that there's some right to take care of one's children, some right to the companionship, care, and custody management of one's children, but that doesn't rise to the same level as physical liberty as an interest. Now, to be clear, there are many more categories of civil cases where counsel is not appointed. And of course, men are litigants in many of those cases as well. Family court's an interesting example because, of course, you've got men and women both involved with neither with counsel. But I mentioned the family court example because my thought is that even if the dynamics aren't literally about whether the parties are men or women, I still think there's something salient about using the lens of gender to understand the value that's being assigned to the particular interests and rights that are at stake. So to explore this further, I'd actually like to take a step back and bring in some earlier research I conducted with a group of welfare rights activists. So it was a different project, but I'm hoping that putting them together brings us some interesting observations. So I interviewed a group of welfare rights activists, all of whom were themselves either receiving welfare at the time or they had been. And what I found, among other things, was that the activists described their welfare rights activism as a form of motherist activism. And they saw their activism as an extension of their caretaking work and their work as mothers. And the activists really emphasized the value of their caretaking work, of their right to take care of their own children, and the value of them taking care of their own children. And they used that as a piece of articulating their particular social agenda in their activism. So they recognized, of course, that welfare regulations in many ways had devalued their caretaking work. And they talked about that, and they talked about the devaluation of the caretaking work by poor black women in particular. But they also connected that, and in some ways this reminds me of comments others have made throughout today and yesterday about, they connected this with the devaluation more broadly of caretaking work and how the sort of particular focus is really just one place, but it's really part of a much bigger piece and it bleeds over into other pieces. What I think was particularly interesting to me about the way they talked about the value of the caretaking work that was almost radical is that they talked about welfare not just as a safety net for when one falls on hard times in an unusual circumstance, but they talked about, they talked about the idea of a need for a broader social support system for caretaking, and caretaking of children and others with needs, as a broad part of how society should be structured. So it's not just an unusual occurrence or an accident happens, but it's very basic to how people function, that people have needs and people have vulnerabilities, and someone has to take care of them. And it makes sense that we should structure society in ways that recognizes that. So a piece of this is the idea that vulnerability is constant in the human condition. And of course it varies between people for various reasons, but as opposed to a sort of liberal construction of independent, autonomous citizens, and that's how we define citizenship, there's a recognition that we actually are interdependent in terms of how we function, and that it makes sense to recognize that in how we design our social systems. So, and this reminds me of some of the earlier discussions about creating a different conception of citizenry, sort of one that recognizes people not only in terms of the market but in other ways as well. So, in the little bit of time that I have left, what I want to suggest is I want to try to bring these different pieces together, and basically what I've been thinking about and want to say is that I think that our way, that some of these observations about the role of caretaking work and the devaluation of caretaking work and the role of vulnerability inform how we structure access to justice. And I mean that I think that certain conceptions of vulnerability and caretaking influence how we decide which rights are fundamental and which ones need to be articulated. I think that there's a part of the division in the approaches to the appointment of counsel incorporates the idea that vulnerability is an exception, that caretaking is a private matter, and that it's not part of core public functions or core public rights. And so I think, given that I have 0 time, I will stop there.
So our next speaker, finally, Andrea Freeman. Is her slide ready?
Yep. Yes.
Okay,
there it is.
perfect.
Okay. I'm gonna go to the podium.
Oh, yeah. Perfect.
Okay. From here I can see you all good. So I have to join the chorus of thank yous to Camille and Mira, and amazing to let me be a part of this. This has been an incredible day. So many people that I admire are here, and I've already learned so much. So let me jump into my paper, which starts with the story of Tabitha and Tyler Walren. So 4 months before Tyler was born, Tabitha began the process of getting him a Medicaid card, but she ran into a series of obstacles. She made multiple trips to 3 different offices trying to get him a card, but was turned away every time because of a computer mistake. Without this card, Tabitha could not schedule an appointment for him with any doctor in the city. Tyler was born on June 27, 1999, when Tabitha was 19. During the birth, Tabitha experienced complications that led to an emergency C-section, an infection, and blood clots. So as a result, she had to spend 12 days in the hospital, and for 10 of them, she could not breastfeed. She also had had a surgery a few years before, and both of these medical conditions should have alerted doctors to the fact that she might have trouble breastfeeding. But instead, they sent her home with reassurances that her body would take care of it and everything would be okay. Tyler lost instead of gained weight in the first few weeks of his life, but Tabitha didn't realize it, because new mothers generally don't see changes in their newborns even when they're dramatic. And without the Medicaid card, clinics continued to turn him away. 7 weeks later, on August 27, 1999, Tabitha found Tyler unresponsive in his crib, and he died in the taxi on the way to the hospital. from malnutrition. When similar tragedies struck white mothers around the country, they led to legal reforms, increasing minimum hospital stays, and other attempts to improve services to new mothers and infants. So when Zion Cox, the son of a white nurse and minister, died of malnutrition under similar circumstances in Denver, the local paper praised his mother, Anne, for her efforts to honor his memory by working to bring medical services to underserved communities. After Tyler's death, there was no outcry to reform the medical system. The media didn't jump on this story of a good mother who was trying to follow best practices by breastfeeding her baby and then lost him due to systemic racial disparities in medical treatment. His death did not serve as a rallying cry for more resources like lactation consultants and clinics in underserved Black neighborhoods. Instead, the prosecution charged Tabitha with second-degree manslaughter. The prosecution's theory was that Tabitha starved Tyler to death to get revenge on his father, Keenan Purcell, who had gotten his new girlfriend pregnant right after he broke up with Tabitha. Tabitha asked her doctor about the possibility of an abortion right after she got this news from Keenan in the waiting room, but she never brought it up again. The prosecution built its case on this one question to the doctor, insisting that Tabitha had always intended to kill her child. Both the prosecution and the New York daily papers demonized Tabitha. The DAs called her a monster, asked the jury what god-awful sound her starving child must have made. Showing the jury autopsy photos of Tyler, he said, on June 27, 1997, God gave Tabitha Walren a baby boy, and in 8 weeks, this is what she did to him. The media coverage of Tabitha and Tyler, as well as Tatiana Cheeks, another Black woman prosecuted after her daughter died of malnutrition, continued a long tradition of vilifying Black mothers. Here, the stereotype does the work of discouraging Black women from breastfeeding, placing the blame on Black mothers instead of the web of institutions and structures that failed them. The jury acquitted Tabitha of manslaughter, but convicted her of criminally negligent homicide, and she was sentenced to 5 years of probation. This stark contrast between the response to white mothers whose babies suffered from malnutrition and Black mothers illustrates the power of the myth of Black women as bad mothers. The story that society tells about Tabitha and Tyler is that breastfeeding is unnatural for Black women, even criminal or deadly. This story also allows corporations to profit from this lie. But Tabitha's story is not a cautionary tale against breastfeeding. It's a story about how the social, medical, and legal systems fail Black women and then punish them for this failure. These structural and institutional failures are really important because low breastfeeding rates are linked to infant mortality, as well as a wide range of illnesses and conditions in infants, children, and mothers. So Black women have the lowest breastfeeding rates, and Black infants have the highest mortality rates, almost double of white infants and more than double of Latinos, Asians, and American Indian Native Alaskans. Black women and children also suffer disproportionately from a host of health problems associated with low breastfeeding rates. And it's not just a class problem, because Latina mothers breastfeed at even higher rates than white women, even though they experience poverty at similar rates. And the low rates for Black women go across all class levels. So the myth of Black women as bad mothers supports an infrastructure that discourages Black women from breastfeeding by making the choice not to do so appear natural and cultural instead of systemic. Now, of course, this is not new, right? It began in slavery, when slave owners had to justify the cruel practice of removing Black mothers from their own infants to serve as wet nurses for white babies. The welfare queen is the current incarnation of this myth. Formula corporations profit from the myth and successfully engage the government in their project to increase formula sales to Black women and frustrate support for breastfeeding. Formula corporations also partner with the media to bring Tabitha's story to television. So they teamed up with CBS to produce an episode of Chicago Hope, which was a very popular medical drama at the time, based on Tabitha's story. They intended their episode to communicate the risks of breastfeeding. So in the episode, a couple rushes their baby into the emergency room, and the baby dies on the operating table from malnutrition. One of the attending doctors is a new mother herself. She's recently gone back to work, and she wants to bring charges against the mother for starving her baby through breastfeeding. Instead, the couple turns around and threatens a lawsuit against the hospital, blaming the baby-friendly practices of the hospital for their own failure to use formula and save the baby's life. At the end of the episode, after the doctor starts to feel like she's failing as a new mother, she apologized to the mother for blaming her for her child's death, but the mother just brushes off the apology. Now, an interesting choice in the episode is that the producers decided to cast Tabitha as a white middle-class woman instead of low-income and black. This choice diverted attention away from the structural issues that prevented Tabitha from accessing proper medical care. Instead, the episode emphasized the criminality and danger of breastfeeding itself. If the character had been black like Tabitha, the notions of criminality and danger would have remained attached to the mother instead of to the act. So by reconfiguring Tabitha's story this way, the episode allowed the demonization of black women to remain in place while furthering the agenda of the formula corporations and discouraging government intervention to promote breastfeeding. So in the little time I have left, I'm going to argue that low breastfeeding rates are a form of food oppression. Food oppression is a theory that I've been developing. It's a critical race and class analysis of food policy. Okay, here's a basic definition, and it has 5 elements. Okay, a facially neutral law, policy, or action that disproportionately harms a marginalized group. There are health disparities between the dominant group and that group. There's a corporate or industry influence over the government that causes the policy choices, and there are cultural values and racial stereotypes that make these health disparities appear natural. Okay, so first element, there's a breastfeeding policy framework that's made up of different policies and laws that affect women's ability to breastfeed. Okay, so ones that promote formula are the distribution of formula through the WIC program, Special Assistance for Women and Children. The failure of the United States to adopt the World Health Organization's code on marketing breast milk substitutes, the lack of baby-friendly requirements for hospitals, and the lack of resources for breastfeeding women in many majority black cities. Laws that make breastfeeding difficult, particularly for low-income women, include welfare reform, which we've heard a lot about today, and workplace accommodation of breastfeeding laws. So all of this policy framework is racially, facially neutral. Some of it is not class neutral because we know that WIC has income eligibility, and some of the Fair Labor Standards Act laws to accommodate breastfeeding were designed to help low-income women, even though they actually don't. But we have a facially neutral race framework where black women are disproportionately harmed. Okay, part of that harm comes from the vulnerability of experiencing racism on so many levels every day. I'm not going to go into that. I think people here understand that. Child welfare, child protection services, removing children from the home, mass incarceration, that makes it very difficult to breastfeed men and women. The government buys more than half of all the formula sold in the United States and gives it away free through the WIC program. But the government gets the money back, most of it, through rebates, which support the WIC programs, which provides the incentive for the USDA to do this, as well as the fact that they need to promote the subsidized commodities of milk and soy that are in formula. So WIC recipients breastfeed at rates of 1/2 to 1/3 less than other women, and black women are disproportionately represented in WIC. The U.S. is the only country to oppose the ban on advertising breast milk substitutes, and it only did so because of lobbying from the formula companies. If they'd signed on, formula companies wouldn't have access to women in hospitals or be able to give the government these incentives. Baby-friendly certification of hospitals would prevent the practice of giving free formula to people who don't need it in the hospital and on discharge, okay, as well as a whole bunch of other policies that help women breastfeed. It's It's not an easy thing to do. Anyone in the room who's been there, Eleanor has twins like me, she knows. Okay, it's hard. You need support. Hospitals in black neighborhoods engage in fewer baby-friendly practices, and many black women don't have insurance policies that allow them to stay in the hospital long enough to have help. Okay, I'm going to go super fast through the rest. Okay, welfare reform. The work to welfare forces women out of the home. Okay, and black women, as we've seen, disproportionately represented. The breastfeeding laws don't help, and a lot of black women live in what are called first food deserts. Okay, third element, health disparities, they're there. Fourth, corporate influence. Okay, corporations, there's all my slides. You know, they give a lot of campaign contributions, they do lobbying, they have a revolving door, and then they get all of these things in return. Okay, they also are the largest contributor to the American Association of Pediatrics. Okay, so they keep that professional association afloat, paying for their conferences and everything else. And in return, pediatricians prescribe formula to mothers like it's a drug instead of a food, right? As well as other things. So that's true too. Okay. Formula corporations also use race-targeted marketing directed at black women. And my next paper on this is going to cover the story of the Fultz quads, which I'll give you in 30 seconds, who were quadruplets born to Annie Mae, who was deaf and mute, and her husband, this sharecropper. And this is the white doctor who delivered the babies, became famous, named them after all of the women in his family, and then sold the rights to their images to the PET Milk Company in perpetuity, basically, in exchange for a nurse and a farm that ended up never yielding anything. So they were used to sell formula for years and years, open up the market of black women to the formula companies. All of them got breast cancer. 3 of them died before they were 55. And you can see why that's another article. Okay, the final element brings us back to the welfare queen. The stereotypes evoked by Tabitha's story. The welfare queen is the ultimate bad mother, right? And she definitely, I think, does not breastfeed. The stereotypes also bolstered by the widespread belief that health and choices like breastfeeding are based on personal characteristics, right? Like laziness and all these other stereotypes, when in fact social psychologists tell us that all of our choices are based on situation, not disposition or character. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, well, I too want to thank Camille and Mira and everybody here for a really wonderful conference. I came on the plane yesterday. I'm going back on a red eye, which just seemed crazy, but I had to be here. So, so thank you. I want to bring us back to a conversation that we began at the end of one of our afternoon sessions yesterday about marriage. So I want to speak specifically about marriage. If the welfare queen was the black community's downfall in Moynihan's mind, marriage was to be its salvation, right? Marriage was the key to full citizenship, is basically what he argued. And in doing so, he really tapped into a narrative of black marriage as citizenship that has been pervasive in this country, inside African America and outside as well. But today, nearly 150 years after the 13th Amendment's ratification, this narrative of marriage as black citizenship is one that I maintain we should resist, if not reject. So I want to make 2 arguments, basically. The first is that marriage very often has been citizenship diminishing for blacks in this country. The real story of marriage is one that involves racial subordination and the creation of caste. It has, in many ways, married African Americans to second-class citizenship in this country, and I'll tell you why I think that's true. Second, I want to make the argument that instead of promoting marriage, I think that what we should be doing is thinking more intentionally about non-marriage. By that I don't mean that we should abolish marriage. I'm not arguing that. But I think thinking outside of marriage, thinking about non-marriage as a potential frame for organization might do as much, if not more, to promote Black civil rights. Okay, so the first argument about marriage being citizenship diminishing. Marriage gets cast as the ideal way to structure families, but it also structures race and inequality in important ways. In a paper called Marriage as Black Citizenship with a big question mark that's going to be coming out soon, I explore the ways in which this has been true for African Americans, but also for Puerto Ricans, for Native Americans, and also for Asian Americans. Because I don't have a lot of time, there's some really great information about other groups. I'm going to focus on African Americans. For Black folks, the narrative of marriage as citizenship derives a lot of its versions from the emancipation period and the images of newly freed slaves flocking to marry en masse. That happened, but it's also true that post-bellum marriage, in many ways, marriages that many former slaves rejected as a frame from their own lives, function less to honor Black-loving relationships than to reestablish white control over former slaves, right? Without slavery, there was no tie to the state for Black Americans. So whites saw that very early on and looked to reestablish that link. And to really understand it, I think you have to only take notice of the fact that as many states rolled out statutes that extended marriage rights to former slaves, sometimes in the very same statute, they also established anti-miscegenation laws and punishment for intermarrying. So for whites, marriage was really key to restoring civic order and to reconstructing the South as well as the nation as a whole. So what did they do? Officials at all levels of government got down to the business of creating Black husbands and wives through law, through trickery, and often through force. Right? They wanted Black citizens who would be gender, sexually, and of course racially compliant. Had to be married in order for that to be true. They used marriage as a way of ensuring that Black families, not the white governments that had enslaved them, internalized the tremendous need and dependency they had after breaking out of bondage themselves. Right? And what happened when it turned out, surprise, surprise, that these families could not take care of that need? Right? We see the very beginnings of the pathologizing of dependency and need. Whites sent Black husbands, who of course were supposed to shoulder most of the burden for taking care of that need, off to labor camps, essentially, where they basically were used as slaves again. They sent Black children, because their parents couldn't care for them, off to apprenticeship programs, which also returned them to laboring in the fields. I could go on, but I think the point, I hope the point has been made, that marriage has been deeply constitutive of race, and of course, we're talking about wives and husbands, of gender, right? Black women in particular couldn't be independent. They had to be tied to their husbands. So, as I said earlier, I really think that marriage has functioned to tie African Americans to second-class citizenship in ways that we have never really broken out of. We talk about discrimination in persistent inequalities in housing, public education, employment. These are threats to Black civil rights that we talk about seriously, but we never put marriage on the list. and I think that we should begin to. Marriage has served not only to define race and to police the borders of racial categories, but it's also intersected with other forms of oppression and institutions that in ways that have had concrete effects on African Americans. We've been talking a lot about welfare, but there are other ways in which this is true. I'm reclaiming the 3 minutes of my 15 minutes that were that was in the program. I'll go fast. Again, I only got to 12. But you think about the fact that anti-miscegenation law provisions not only defined who you could marry, in many places they were incorporated into other laws. Anti-miscegenation laws could define where you could go to school and even where you live. There's a Richmond ordinance that was adopted in the 1920s that grafted anti-miscegenation law onto housing law. So we decry the denial of 40 acres and a mule, but I think the marriage should be added to our list of laments that Black people in the wake of slavery had to internalize their own dependency under law, at least under the way that whites thought about marriage, made it easier for them, let them off the hook, if you will, for having to provide meaningful reparations for us in lots of ways. So the idea that marriage is at the foundation of all our rights, and this was a very common sentiment articulated during Reconstruction, is one that has never really been seriously challenged in African America, and I think that needs to change. We need to think for the first time really about what the place of marriage should be in 21st century America. On the numbers, marriage ain't what it used to be. For lots of people, but certainly for African Americans, we're the most unmarried group of any in the country, and the statistics that prompted Moynihan to draft his report have only increased. They've tripled, really, in terms of non-marital births. We're almost at 70%. There's lots of work by sociologists. Sarah McClanahan is focused on so-called fragile families. African Americans are overwhelmingly represented in that group. Many of those fragile families, most of them headed by single Black mothers, they're more likely to have less than a high school diploma, to live at or below the poverty line, to suffer housing insecurity. I can go on and on and on. The stereotype about these mothers and the men with whom they make their families is that they don't want to be married, that they don't value it. But in fact, just the opposite is true. They almost value it too much. They don't want to enter marriage unless they can be financially secure. They are, because of the persistent inequalities that they face, really locked into non-marriage in a way that is difficult for them to get out. The persistent inequalities that they face compound the effects of structural practices and institutions that already regulate these families. All families are regulated by the government, but the problem for fragile Black families, female-headed Black families, is that this regulation is too often very punitive and insufficiently attuned to the challenges that poverty presents for families. Okay, very quickly in 2 minutes. Marriage is not going to secure Black citizenship for us anytime soon. Eleanor Holmes Norton said this in the wake of the Moynihan Report's release and the move to excise the matrilineal pattern from the Black communities. She said it will be impossible to reconstruct the Black family if its central characters are to be crepe paper copies acting out the old white family melodrama. Right? Real change requires flipping the script. I suggest that embracing non-marriage is one way to do that. Marriage itself masks the inequalities that the so-called fragile families face. Neoliberals say, hey, get married, you'll get all the benefits. In fact, low-income families are more likely to get a marriage penalty than a benefit for all sorts of reasons. So what I think we should do instead is to try to meet non-marital families where they are instead of trying to drag them into marriage's regulatory shadow. Real quickly, alternative approaches, lots that family law scholars have begun to look at. None of the research in this area, though, really has African American families, Black families at its core. I think that people in this room need to begin to change that, to think about what our particular needs are, and also to think about what our capabilities are, which is something that you don't think of when you think of Black welfare queens. Nobody talks about our capacities, our capabilities, but we need to. President Obama has his Brothers Keeper initiative, and it's all based on deadbeat dads. We have those. Both my grandfathers walked out on my grandmothers, who became welfare mothers as a result. So they're there, but the truth is, the statistics show is that African American men in non-marital families, more than white men, more than Latino men, they're more likely to see and be involved with their children, and they are better able, for reasons that we don't know because we haven't looked at it, to maintain a positive co-parenting relationship with their former partners. We need to figure out why that is, to capitalize on that. Doing so, I think, could have three benefits, and then I really will sit down. One, I think it creates room for gender norms within the African American community to change, right? Part of that idea that I can't get married until everything is right has to do with the internalization of gender norms that date back to slavery. Why can't Black mothers be normative breadwinners, not just because they have to, because they can, because we can support them? Why can't Black fathers be not deadbeat dads, but great caretakers for their children? Ultimately, we come up with better policies. We shift the frame in a way that destigmatizes Black loving relationships and finds ways to provide support for all families.
So that was a great set of talks we just heard. Before I open the floor, let me just say a few things, maybe pose a question or two. So first, I want to say I was so happy to hear sociology evoked repeatedly in the talks. Like suddenly I felt at home. But what I really found interesting here in this panel, which was really trying to focus our attention on the constitution of mothering, is how the papers didn't really. So they got to that question of how mothering is constituted by not looking at it directly, but sort of going to it like kind of in like circularly, and really foregrounding then that the constitution of mothering is contingent on all these other social forces in society. And so, so one question that was raised for me as I was listening, and I want the entire panel to sort of address this, was that, so especially this was evoked by the talk of Eleanor Brown, was that there's a certain, cultural constitution of a welfare queen, and people of color, Blacks in particular, have a different relationship to this construction, and that we need to really talk about the various social locations and the diversity, particularly the classes, not just like backgrounds, like of whether they're foreign or native, among African Americans, and sort of what does that heterogeneity and diversity mean then for the constitution of this welfare queen image, and what kind of different relationships do people in the African American community have to that image, and what does that then do to relationships within and among African Americans, and how does the welfare queen image then become a distancing mechanism that create sort of tensions within the African American community. And so I just want to, maybe I'll ask 2 more questions, but one other thing that I had going on in my head as I was listening was that, the discussion of what is caregiving, and how that's sort of an underlying question behind the constitution of the welfare queen, and that different groups of people, depending on your social location in society, you have a different relationship as a woman or even as a man to that concept of caregiving, and how in society, whether it's in state policies, but also in everyday ideologies we carry, like we all have like a different relationship to this construct of caregiving, where certain women deserve to be caregivers and certain women do not. And so if you look, for example, or that certain mothers are paid, or certain women are paid to be caregivers, but then they don't have a right to be caregivers of their own children, or how even the privileged women, research shows that when they go to work and they leave their kids at home, there's a lot of guilt involved in that. And so then it comes from this right that women are the rightful caregivers of their children, but that sort of burden and privilege at the same time is denied particular groups of women. So I wanted just to talk about sort of the construction of caregiving and the relationship of that construct vis-a-vis the welfare queen. And lastly, I was really struck by this last discussion of Lenhard on marriage as a controlling mechanism. And that so then this notion of marriage as a controlling mechanism, and I think it does raise this good question of how then if we redefine marriage, and how in the talk I think yesterday it was emphasized that marriage is so central to kind of the identity of the U.S., how breaking that down could then lead to even the breaking down of this construct of the welfare queen, I think is a good question. So let me end there. You could answer these questions, or we could just open it up to the audience as well. And how much time do we have? Because we went over, so I have no idea when we're supposed to end.
It's like
Because we were supposed to end at 3:15 and it's 3:04. So till 4 then? So we have 20 minutes. Okay. So we can open it up, or you could address some of these questions.
Could I say something?
Yes, yeah.
This follows somewhat from what Robin was saying. This follows somewhat from what Robin was saying. What I was thinking during Dorothy's presentation yesterday is, I think part of the problem right now is we're running, the way the country is currently structured is there's a bifurcated society in which elites are getting married and continuing to get married, and sticking to that paradigm very clearly, and others are not. Now it seems to me that I would say more than that. I would say as the stakes have become as clear as they have become, I mean, there's all of this stuff we're reading now about competitive parenting and hyper parenting, and the reason that people do that is because they feel that the stakes for falling off of the economic wagon are so high that you gotta be conditional in the love that you give to your children. Make it very, as David Brooks put it in the New York Times today, so that it's extremely clear that you need to do particular things. And I think marriage has become one of those things. I think elites are communicating to their children that getting married is very, very important, just like getting into college and getting into a good college. Now it seems to me that part of what needs to happen is that elites, including academics, need to problematize a paradigm in which marriage is reified, And I mean this across the board. I don't just mean this for poor black people, I mean for everybody. And in which the distribution of benefits is tied to your marital status. And it seems to me that we have missed repeated opportunities to do that. I said yesterday that, even in my own life and, at my own university, I see it so regularly. And so what I think it's not sufficient for us to say it's fine, we're married, and it works for us. And, if they choose not to be married, we will defend their right not to be married. And we will say, oh yes, their benefits should not be contingent on marriage. While saying absolutely nothing about that bifurcation. And that. Am I making sense? Yeah. I think there's some inconsistency there. I haven't quite figured out how to say it in a more precise way. But I would just add that.
I agree. I would say too, I will be among those celebrating when I hope the Supreme Court issues a favorable decision in DeBoer. But I think that this movement for marriage equality was one of those moments where we had an opportunity for people to come together. We're talking about coalition building, coming together and saying, you know what, we don't really have to do it this way. We can support children, we can support caregiving, we can address need, not because we want to necessarily participate in the market, but because that's who we are, that's what we do. There were so many places where we could have done that, and I think the understandable fear that it might not work really led advocates to take a different path, and in doing so to often trade on notions of race that were unfortunate. But when the decision comes down, I'm going to say yay, but let's take the moment after the moment to really do that and to rethink how we do this, because I think it's not working. There are class divides within the black community as well, but certainly as compared to whites, we're very much disadvantaged. Not much wealth transfer going on for us, and long term, I just don't see how it changes without a real structural, institutional shift of epic proportions.
Oh yes.
Wonderful panel. Each of the presentations were truly marvelous, and reminds me that something that often is left off the table happens to be the first of fathers who abandoned black children. And I always think of this, right, as a sort of narrative is located in Jim Crow, but it really goes back to the antebellum time with white fathers selling their children, with Thomas Jefferson not claiming his children, with George Washington. And in this narrative that locates it 20 years ago, like, oh, suddenly black children are fatherless, when in fact the very legacy of being a black child in the United States began with white fathers not only abandoning their children, but selling their children and sending them away and trading them. And so to have this discourse evolve through government that fails to take any account for that is just absolutely absurd. And then the various machinations that came during Jim Crow that made it virtually impossible to keep a father in the home if the family was to have any kind of sustenance whatsoever. I'd love for there to be just more on that, because it almost seems rhetorical, yet it's so incredibly real.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think also when you have fathers who are connected, Rick got the title from his book from a Washington Post article that a woman who was teaching a class, I think as a substitute teacher, wrote. And it's about a conversation that she's having with these black kids in DC, and they're talking about families, and she says, oh, I have married friends, I'll have them come in and talk to you. And they were like, whoa. Especially the boys. We just want to be good fathers. We don't want to necessarily be married. And we don't have that. We don't have the conversation about why it's difficult to be good fathers, or how it's possible to be a good father and not be married. And I think that is a real problem.
Can I tag something on that comes to mind between my talk and yours, Robin, which is that in these studies that have been done by the CDC and other organizations about who talks to their kids
Yes.
about sex, as it turns out, amongst all ethnic groups, what's reported is that black parents, particularly black dads, do better in that regard than any other group.
Yeah. Yes.
That's a question.
Yes.
So I guess one of the issues that was prominent in my mind as I was thinking about this panel is the tension between the identity construct one has as the ideal worker and the identity construct of being an ideal mother. And I think breastfeeding really brings this to the fore, because it's kind of based on this model of marriage where you have a woman who's able to stay at home and provide this kind of breastfeeding access on demand, which becomes very difficult in the workforce, as I can attest to. Putting breast milk through airline security things is an experience everyone should have at least once.
I pumped in the LA airport.
And so I'm wondering, to sort of connect this together, is at the site of activism, did you encounter anything in your interviews with welfare activists about breastfeeding rights? Are there sort of identity stereotypes that black women are negotiating in terms of embodiment and feeling sort of maybe somewhat more uncomfortable with breastfeeding because of the history of wet nurses and things of that nature? And how does formula sort of fit into that equation?
Yeah. So one aspect I didn't talk about today, but is part of the work, is about the cultural aspects and about the history of over-sexualization of black women, and how both women themselves and also partners and mothers, like grandmothers, put strong pressure not to breastfeed, and especially not to breastfeed in public. So there is that. And also relating to Rossel's question about internalization. Right? You were saying, well, what are the internal struggles? Right? Even though it's all situational, I think even women themselves feel that it's not, right? That it's that guilt as well, right? Like, well, I can't breastfeed, and then all of this selling of formula as just as good, right? When in fact it's nowhere near as good, but we need it because the entire structure of society does not allow you, unless you're incredibly privileged, to continue breastfeeding once you have to go back to work, which under welfare is in some states 6 weeks, right? And for most people, realistically, pretty right away.
So is there some, I know Rebecca from Sunnybrook Farm sometime, but is there an objective possibility in sort of talking about how the welfare work requirements would prevent you from being the ideal mother, would prevent you from actually discharging these breastfeeding obligations? And how does that like interact with the whole discourse going around between middle class mothers as breastfeeding as a form of oppression, and you have to be this kind of ideal mother and you have to subordinate yourself in this particular way? Is there any, we were talking about opportunities for coalition or interest convergence, and I'm wondering if there's anything productive there.
It's interesting. It reminds me that the women that I talked to really did, as I mentioned, see what their activism is related to their mothering work, an extension of that, and I don't think. And part of what was interesting was it reminded me of some other motherist movements where the idea was to really turn that into a good thing and a piece of the story instead of not. In terms of, if you all want us to be the mothers that you're telling us to be, then you need to let us do certain things. You need to give us certain kinds of tools. When that's effective and when it's not is complicated. And I think partly by the idea of needs, that I think some of it is about, we as mothers need to perform these particular roles, and we are dependent on you to let us do that, and we need you to do certain things. And then you get into some difficult places, right? I mean, we get into when your identity is then formed, and what you're asking for is formed based on the vulnerability and on the needs too much. Then one of the reasons that I am sometimes more attracted to a different story is that it sometimes feels like one has to give up a certain dignity in the articulation of what you're looking. But my hope is that one can bring those things together. That is, we can recognize that yes, you're asking me to do these things and I want to do these things on certain terms, but that I need to have some dignity in terms of how I define how I'm going to perform these roles as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to link the themes of missed opportunities for progressives. The point that Eleanor's been hammering about the sort of American exceptionalism of making marriage the fulcrum of all kinds of benefits that in other societies are available in a way that's not linked to marriage. And then the earlier comment about health benefits and Obamacare, because it seems to me that that's a perfect example of a missed opportunity for progressives, and specifically for sort of revealing, this also goes to the point about the link between labor systems and employment systems and family structures. Both leading up to the formulation of the policy that became embodied in the Affordable Care Act and after, both sides of the debate have largely accepted the characterization of the choice as, single payer versus preserving the old private system. And what progressives, we, largely failed to do in a way that would be, it seems to me that was a perfect opportunity to make visible to the public the fact the so-called private system, yes, it's, in the manner of neoliberalism, yes, it's a market-based system, yes, it enriches, but it's also a government subsidized system. It's a system, right? How do people get health benefits before Obamacare, and how do they still get it? But you get it either because you're employed by an employer who provides a health benefit plan, or you're married to someone who does. Those two things are linked. And crucially, this is what that benefit is propped up by government subsidies in the form of tax exemptions. It's a government subsidy. It's a handout, but that goes to relatively privileged people. And instead of seizing the occasion to say that's what's going on, it's just factual, we accept the rhetoric that says it's a choice between private and public, which completely, and fails to sort of reveal these linkages and the perversity of so I just want to, it's not a question, I just think it's a perfect example of the rightness of these points that a number of you have made.
So we actually have to wrap up now, but does anyone have a last word to say that they're dying to say? Okay, yes?
Hi, Antoinette Dozier from Western Center on Non-Poverty. And just to Neil's question, we actually had a bill, I think about a year ago, that permitted and required any woman who is participating in welfare to work to be allowed to breastfeed and be given a space to breastfeed while participating in their welfare to work activities, and that they were allowed to actually breastfeed within welfare offices, because they were told, even though you have to stay here all day and wait in the office all day if you're breastfeeding, you cannot do so here. And so that was a bill that passed, and the way in which we were able to build a coalition was around a reproductive coalition, a reproductive justice coalition, but the also sort of backroom sort of deal that was kind of cut was that we were also advocating for diapers, the ability for every welfare to work participant or welfare recipient to be able to receive a certain amount of diapers every month, and that was sort of deemed to be too costly, and this was sort of like a cheaper bone to give to the coalition that year. So
could I just say really quickly in response to, this for me is a very tangible, I think your point is, all these points are so well made, but to your point here, this is the reason we're missing the opportunities, because I've experienced it in my own life. I said yesterday, it's a delicate point, but I think it's an important point. I said yesterday that when I came back from Jamaica and I was in a faculty meeting and we were considering persons to be hired. I remember being totally blown over that we were talking about, and this is happening in law faculties all over the country. Now, most of us in here are law professors, but not everybody. So let me just explain what has happened structurally. What has happened is that the legal academies, FUCKED, to forgive my language, there are fewer and fewer law jobs. Persons meet in law school, they're disproportionately likely to marry other lawyers, they're disproportionately likely to marry other people who are interested in legal academia. And so what would have happened historically was that the guy would have gotten a job and she would not have gotten to do what she wanted to do. Am I laying it out in plain language? And so the accommodation that has been made, no, this is what has happened. The accommodation that has been made is we're not comfortable with the notion that one spouse gets to do what they want to do, and the other spouse, who really also wanted to be an academic, doesn't get to do what they want to do. And so the accommodation we have made is that we are going to try, whenever possible, to make an offer not just to one spouse, but to make an offer to two spouses. I don't know if this is happening in law faculty, in other faculties, but this is definitely happening in the law. So what that means is that this is, I'm not just talking, I'm not saying anything that is not known. I'm not speaking out of school. This is happening all over the country. Now, when I first came, I thought to myself, who are the people who do not have access to marriage? People who are LGBT, people who are disproportionately likely to be black, people who are, how is it that we are distributing this good? I mean, it's a private good, but a very scarce good, and considering whether or not, now, that's my initial thought, but then my next thought is, but this is a country which prioritizes marriage. How could they not have gotten married? This is what they were expected to do. If I don't go along with this, what I'm doing is perpetuating a situation in which one spouse gets to do what they really want to do, and the other spouse doesn't. And so I literally find myself, that was what was going through my head. And so I literally find myself in a situation where if I vote one way, I'm damned, and if I vote another way, I'm damned. Am I making sense? And that is the compromises that we're making, rather than hitting it head on and saying, what is happening structurally? That we're in a situation where one spouse is going to get to do what they want and one isn't, and what can we do about that situation more fundamentally? We're doing band-aids, you get what I'm saying? And that is, so what I'm saying is, I'm acknowledging that there was a decision-making point. There was a conversation that needed to be had. I avoided the conversation and went along with the vote, and did it multiple times. You understand? And what I'm saying is that is reifying an institution to which fewer and fewer people have access, largely on the basis of class and race and many other things, right? And we're participants in it, and it's just not good enough to say we're going to try work this out for poor black people and not have a conversation about the broader thing. That's my point. Yeah. So what you said just hit me right at the core, because that was a point to make a decision, and I passed on the decision.
Well, to be fair to you, you also would have had to say the trailing spouse was not our first pick, not as strong, and that makes it difficult too, right?
Yeah, no, the point is. Yeah, but my point is we're doing that, and we're doing it as law professors. If there's anywhere that we should be able to have that conversation, it is in the law. And we're not having that conversation, am I making any sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Always makes sense.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, panelists.